Is this, people, you know what the critics will say? They'll say, this is just Zuckerberg cowering to Trump. We can look at it that way. Or do we look at it like Zuckerberg and his companies cowered to the Biden administration and should have never been in this position in the first place?
I don't think those things are mutually exclusive, Brian. They could both be true. I mean, people have said for a long time that politics is downstream from culture, but I like to say that business is downstream from politics. And so obviously this is a response to the Trump win. And he basically admits later in the video, something that I've been saying to you on air for a couple of years now, that elements of the federal government during the Biden administration were coercing and pressuring big tech companies, including his own, to violate the First Amendment. And that's a huge problem. It's what inspired our fund to be created that you alluded to invest in companies that were not going to capitulate to that level of pressure. So I think embedded in this announcement is something even more troubling, which was that the previous administration was violating our rights.
The headlines, some of the headlines, you've seen them, Omeed, are basically like, oh, Facebook and Meta, whatever you want to call it, they're getting rid of fact checkers, which the implication is if you just read the headline, that there's no more fact checking and thus put whatever you want on there. And no doubt there will be some garbage that leaks through, even under the community notes system. But it sounds like you don't, as an investor, Omeed, you don't believe this is going to be some kind of big negative. Maybe it's a positive for the Meta-owned companies.
First of all, it's a huge positive. I mean, obviously, I have my caveats that I'll offer that I think this is definitely opportunistic, and I can personalize why that's the case. But putting that aside for a moment, it is a net positive. It turns out that free speech is good business. And I think they see that the American people overwhelmingly want this. It's also the whole topic we've discussed in the past also about the challenge of legacy media and what happened in this presidential election. So much of the communication with people occurred in independent media on these podcasts. So any big company, whether you're a network or a big tech business, sees where the leaves are blowing, and they're trying to go towards where the people are now. And that is a real embrace of constitutional protections, free speech. But of course, the question I'll ask is whether or not this is just opportunistic. Is the company we took public yesterday, which is, yes, you're right, a gun retailer with our SPAC, it sells guns. Over half the country owns a firearm. Right now, you cannot advertise on Meta with firearms at all. It's banned. So my question is, if he's rediscovered the Constitution, how far does that go? And I think that remains to be seen, Brian.
That's an interesting question, Omeed. It's Kelly here. If I may actually pick up on that same vein, which is two other possible things I wonder about. Number one, and he admitted this in the video, like, look, there's going to be slightly less ability for us to catch all the bad stuff when we're having a lighter touch about everything. They're already under pressure for whatever's been going on Instagram, child sex trafficking, that kind of thing. So that's one possible issue investors might be a little bit squeamish about. The other thing is I wonder when he says, and to your point about when he says, look, when the American government tries to censor us, it emboldens other governments to censor even more. But how much of a fight is he willing to get into with other governments, whether it's the UK or Europe or Latin America, about these free speech issues, which really only apply, or those legal protections only apply to Americans?
You just picked up on, I think, the most important question we have right now for the future of capitalism. It's a fight that we're having at home. It's the fact that politics has infiltrated, red and blue America. We're one of the only countries in the world that has a Bill of Rights, Kelly, and that's what I think we really need to understand, that if you only look at it away from that, then you're going to have the kind of authoritarian systems that you have in other countries that, by the way, do fairly well financially. Like China has social credit scoring, and they're the second largest economy in the world. So we need to be very careful about totally separating those constitutional freedoms from economics. It's why we've incorporated so much into what we're working on. And I think you're pointing out that you need to have a United States government and administration that's in favor of strong constitutional protections that then empowers our multinational businesses to do business abroad. And it really goes full circle, which was the irony that we had where a lot of these big woke companies would go do business in China where they have slave labor and then lecture us about not being progressive enough. I think that stuff's got to stop too.
But the critics, Omeed, what they're going to say is that Zuckerberg is afraid of Trump, that he appointed Dana White of the UFC, who's one of Trump's biggest friends and backers, to the board. And he's facing a lawsuit, I think it starts in April, and that this is just Zuckerberg being afraid and responding to the incoming administration.
Hey, look, I don't have a lot of issue with that critique either, by the way, because you know what? You got to judge people when things are hard. What did his company do when it was hard to stand up against an administration? He totally capitulated. You know who's vindicated here? Elon Musk and what he did when he bought X. And a lot of the mainstream media said he's going to destroy that company. It stinks. And then guess what? It was the most important platform, just like I predicted on your show 2 years ago during the election. And he stood up against the censorship regime. And I think he's been rewarded for it because now it's the most important social media platform in the world. And you see other things like Rumble or Truth Social that are all coming around and being able to be successful because they have the following that folks want. I don't see, regardless of where you're on the political spectrum, you should look back at a period like 2020, 2021 and be very troubled. Like when one of my partners started that company, Parler, that was a social media app, that a few big tech companies colluded to deplatform it. Like that's wrong. That's anti-American. So I'm just very happy to see that even big companies are starting to realize the error of their ways. But you're right. There is an element here that could be opportunistic, that they're simply responding to whatever administration is in power. So I urge customers and users to really analyze and hold their feet to the fire, which is to say, how are you going to act regardless of who's in power?
Right.
And I think there's a lot of other companies out there that stood up to the censorship regime of the Biden administration.